Now, the idea of micro-foundations. Essentially, this search for micro-foundations as opposed to macro foundations is based or premised upon the claim that classes or groups or nations do not act, individuals act. And classes or groups are an aggregation of individuals. To start with, to start your analysis with group interests, whether conceptualized as class interests or ethnic group interests, is a non-starter. Groups do not act, individuals constituting groups act. Therefore, group action has to be understood in terms of why individuals that are part of that group would act in a certain way. The whole discipline of economics begins with the idea of self-interest, not group interest. Right? It's premised upon that. So in order for you to show that groups act, you need to also provide the micro-foundations of individuals' behavior that would go into, inform, shape group behavior. Right? Now, so this leads to something we discussed yesterday. In economics and rational choice theory, this leads to the collective action problem. Because the assumption is that individual interests and group interests are not the same. Right? Individuals would like the benefits of group action, but would not like to pay the costs of group action. Therefore, you'll have the so-called free rider problem, free riding or collective action problem. It will be hard to put together group action given this argument. So, but we do know a lot of group action takes place. We do know that groups are mobilized not only for extraction of resources or for political power, sometimes for group action leads to a lot of violence, and still people participate in group action. So how do we solve this problem? Within rational choice, the big idea is focal point. This is the originally proposed by Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling. What is the focal point? It was with a very folksy insight for which Thomas Schelling was famous. He proposed that, quote, when a man loses his wife in a department store without any prior understanding on where to meet if they get separated, the chances are good that they will find each other. It is likely that each will think of some obvious place to meet, so obvious that each will be sure that the other is sure that it is obvious to both of them. I do say, we are of course talking about the pre-cell phone days, when you can call and find out where the spouse is, right? So this is an idea of focal point, and the proposal is that ethnicity is a focal point. A focal point resolves the collective action problem. In what way? It basically is distinguished by uniqueness or prominence. That is why it can be used to facilitate the development, and this is important, development of mutually consistent expectations. All you need is a charismatic leader. All you need is a charismatic leader mobilizing ethnicity, and people will come because everybody understands ethnicity. Right? So ethnicity could serve as a focal point, and ethnic mobilization could simply require coordination of expectations. Ethnicity does not have to be intrinsically valuable for it to be politically useful. So the next question obviously is, why is ethnicity a focal point? Why not class? Why can't class play the same role, and those who've read Marxist literature and have studied the history of the Soviet Union and communist world would also say, why can't party, a political party, play that role? After all, the Soviets had argued that in the communist era, a new man would be created who would find a home in the party, not in the nation, not in class. Political party would provide that home. The question is, why does ethnicity do it so much better as a focal point than class or party? The answer, Russell Harden, who's used Schilling's focal point to make the case, who is within the rational choice tradition, the answer is epistemological comforts of home. Ethnicity provides epistemological comforts of home. Question is, why should ethnicity provide these comforts, not class, economic interest, or party? And there is no answer within rational choice. There is no answer in an instrumental rational framework. Why do I feel attached to ethnicity more, or many people do, than to a political party or to a class? Can one really, therefore, explain ethnic preferences in an entirely instrumental, rational way, or is recourse to psychological or cultural foundations necessary? It is easier to understand ethnicity, for it means something, presumably. For a whole variety of psychological or cultural reasons, human beings are attached to it. Micro-foundations, therefore, are likely to be primarily psychological and cultural, based on attachment, meaning, even prejudice, not primarily rational, based on cost-benefit calculation. I hope it's clear that the instrumental rational view, which is at the heart of rational choice and at the heart of economics, is fundamentally in tension with how psychologists argue. Fundamentally in tension. Right? For psychologists, attachments, meaning, prejudice, hatred even, they play a very big role in the analysis of human conduct. Whereas economics and rational choice says human conduct can be reduced to cost-benefit calculations and in terms of interest. Right? Now, what could this cultural micro-foundation or psychological micro-foundation might be? And here, we turn to a different stream of inquiry, which says that the account of micro-foundations of ethnic and national resistance or national assertion requires sensitivity to historically inherited attitudes, prejudices, and power relations among ethnic groups. Power, prejudice, hierarchy among groups is missing in the rational choice analysis of micro-foundations or economic analysis of micro-foundations, and you cannot understand this without these terms. By starting with individuals and not the cultural or historical inheritances and power relations within which individuals may be embedded, a typical economic account misses much of what motivates ethnic or nationalist conduct. Now, that may be fine, but if you do include historically inherited attitudes, prejudices, and power relations, how would the argument go? And here we have the most remarkable and convincing proposal. A lot of scholars would agree with what Charles Taylor, a Canadian political philosopher, has proposed. His argument about modern identity goes as follows. First, in pre-modern times, this will go towards another view of micro-foundations, as you will see in a moment. In pre-modern times, one's identity, who am I, where am I coming from, was given or fixed by one's place in the hierarchical social structure, it was not negotiated. People belonged to certain stations and lived according to those stations. Hierarchies were quite acceptable. The rise of modernity has led to an increasing decay of traditional social hierarchies, ideationally or structurally. As a result, for the first time in history, a new individual motivation has arisen. That modern motivation is called dignity. One does not take one's station as inevitable. Especially those ranked lower in society. And that could be low ranking could be because of ethnicity, because the color is black, because the hair is of a particular kind, because the language is inferior, because the religion is inferior, right? Because the occupation of that particular ethnic group is inferior or demeaning or polluting. That particular view is no longer accepted as easily as it was in pre-modern times. So there is a movement from what used to be called honor to dignity. And the pursuit of dignity, the second argument, the pursuit of dignity and self-respect is not monological but dialogical. Meaning what? The dialogue takes place in a social context. Hermits might define dignity monologically, tapasya in the Himalayas, let's say. But the more general pursuits of dignity require recognition from society. This is especially so because society is not a random collection of individuals. Rather, it comes with a historical inheritance of perceptions and misperceptions. Our identity as modern human beings, in the most famous passage of this book, is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others, and so person or groups of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining, a demeaning, or contemptible picture of themselves. Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm and can be a form of oppression, imprisoning someone in a false, distorted, and the most famous part of this most famous passage, a reduced mode of being. Treating that group as less than human sometimes, or inferior for a whole variety of reasons that can be given. Now, the argument then is that a lot of ethnic and national assertions, certainly of lower groups when they resist, is a reflection of the pursuit of dignity and self-respect. The key word here is dignity and words are dignity and self-respect, not economically defined or materially defined self-interest, which drives the rational choice discourse. Dignity as the micro-foundation. Self-respect as the micro-foundation. Now, would this argument apply to those who are at the upper levels of this hierarchy? Is this only about resistance or about also those who are in the upper levels of hierarchy? Whether this applies only to nationalism of resistance or ethnic assertion, which is about resistance, which is about fighting demeaning images, which is about fighting contemptible pictures, which is about fighting confining roles, which the pre-modern man, pre-modern human being accepted as natural state of life, as what God willed. But that is not acceptable anymore, or less acceptable. I think you might want to say, instead of binary, you might say less acceptable. Right? Okay. So, does this apply to Afrikaners in South Africa? Brahmins in India? Does this apply to whites in America? Germans against Jews? Or it only applies to Jews against Germans? Dalits against upper caste? colonized citizens against colonial masters. So it's best to, therefore, best to separate, best to partition the idea of ethnic assertion or nationalism into nationalism of resistance and nationalism of exclusion. Right? Or ethnic assertion from above and ethnic assertion from below. These are two different things. One is clearly an expression of prejudice historically inherited. And the other is a fight against prejudice which was historically imposed. These are two different kinds of ethnic assertions. This is a micro-foundational account of assertion from below. Right? Therefore, in the arguments, if you look at some other psychological theories, prejudice and hatred play a very big role in the way ethnic assertion is exercised from above. How do you prove that the pursuit of dignity was absent in pre-modern times? His answer has been, he is a political philosopher. He doesn't do systematic empirical work. He reflects on empirical realities, right? And constructs philosophical categories which are about empirical reality, but it's not based on serious induction. Now the question is that induction about the pre-modern times is not, full induction is not possible. You will pick some examples, you will give some accounts. What I can do today with my data, I can't do with historical data. Right? So then this particular argument that about honor, right, as opposed to dignity, and only some have honor, not everybody has honor. This is technically speaking, right? Only some people would get the Booker Prize, not everybody. You see it that way. That's the notion of honor here. So technically, not everybody has honor, though everybody can have dignity. Right? So why is it the case that honor drove human conduct in pre-modern times as opposed to dignity? His argument is that the accounts that we have, historical accounts that we have, suggest that hierarchies were considered natural. Birth-based hierarchies was considered natural. The idea of station, that comes from Plato. The idea of station, that you live according to your station. Right? You know, the idea of railway station came from this actually, right? So the station in life, you were born a peasant. You could not be a lord. You were born, you can think of a low, and whatever that lowly quote-unquote ethnic group is, or race is. You cannot go up. Right? And sometimes this idea was defined in terms of divine will. Right? So he's saying that very few, ask yourself whether in modern times people would argue like that. Some would, but many would stop arguing like that. They don't even think of that. Right? So he says this particular proposition is not based on great scientific induction, but available accounts of pre-modern human conduct suggest that dignity was not a concept that was understood. So here is a famous economist, Paul Collier, who argued that he could explain ethnic civil wars or civil wars in general by looking only at the economics of it. Nothing else was required. So civil war could be modeled as an industry in which looting generates profits. Leaders of rebellions are driven by a desire to amass fortunes. There is no assertion here. There is no idea about dignity here. It's about amassing fortunes. Why do masses join? Remember, in the discussion yesterday, we are again and again asked, why would masses join? Leaders might be interested in this, right? Why would masses join something so risky, which might lead to incarceration, injury, or death? These are high risks, or in the theoretical language, these are grotesque risks. Grotesquely risky behavior rational individuals don't engage in. So why would they participate? That problem was solved within economic reasoning by this point that Collier proposed. Masses join them in poor societies with very few economic opportunities because the opportunity costs of participation in rebellion are low and the benefits in the form of share of the loot are quite substantial. What does it mean? There is nothing else to do. There are no jobs, there are very few jobs. So the cost of participation is not so high and there is a possibility of sharing the loot. This is how it's being explained. What else would you do? You have nothing else to do in a poor society with very few economic opportunities. And then a further claim that given their geographical concentration, natural resources are especially lootable commodities. Civil wars predominantly erupt in economies highly dependent on natural resource extraction. Now, I don't want to critically comment on this. I just want to show you how that research program evolved. This is step number 1. So a whole program was launched. And the next step in the research program, this is sort of what we call cumulative process of inquiry. You make an argument today, then there is commentary on that argument. You try and refine that argument in light of commentary and evidence, more evidence if necessary, and then you see whether you were right or wrong. The second round, when the data set was enlarged, coding further finessed, model specification stage, they concluded that we cannot reject one model in favor of the other, and while the greed model is superior, some elements of the grievance model are likely to add to its explanatory power. So there's a greed-based model, you estimate that. Statistically, through econometrics, there's a grievance-based model, and then you see which explains how much. In the first step of the research program, grievance explained nothing, and greed explained a lot. In the next step in the evolution of the program, grievance model started explaining a bit, but greed models were still superior. And the third step, round 3 of this research program, the findings of this statistical model were subjected to chosen case studies. Why? Case studies were commissioned. 30 case studies were commissioned. Specialists of each civil war asked to write an account of why civil war arose, what kinds of people participated in that, and what can we say about their motivations or their micro foundations. Why did they participate? And so why would you choose case studies? Here was the methodological claim. Even if the statistical model predicted all cases of civil war onset perfectly, it would still not be able to tell us much about the process through which these outcomes, war or peace, are generated. By contrast, analyzing the process, the sequence of events and the interaction of variables in the statistical model over time is the comparative advantage of case study designs. Qualitative analysis can help us sort out the endogenous from the exogenous. So exogenous is the cause, endogenous is the consequence. Cause and consequence cannot be sorted out in statistical models. That's been claimed for a very long time. You only get correlations, but not whether A caused B or B caused A. That A and B are connected is what you can establish very clearly. But correlation is not causation, so in search of causation, they went for case studies. 30 case studies are good enough. One may not be able to tell you much about causation. 30 case studies, carefully chosen, are good enough to tell you about cause and effect. And what emerged from that? Final conclusion of this research program, quote, the distinction between greed and grievance should be abandoned for a more complex model that considers greed and grievances as inextricably fused. Motives for civil war. So this 10-year research program, which started with purely economic reasoning and a claim that economics was all that you needed to explain civil wars, ended up saying that that claim was wrong. And this is a very interesting way to understand how research proceeds. 2 famous economists starting this whole research program, making very strong claims, and ending up 10 years later invalidating or expressing deep skepticism about their whole approach and about the substantive claims they made. This is a fairly scientific evolution, incidentally. So you shouldn't blame them for not pursuing the matters scientifically. You can blame them for starting incorrectly, but not for pursuing the matter scientifically and coming after 10 years to a conclusion that economics does not work when you think of civil wars or ethnic conflict. Where Weber basically says that the economic view of rationality is only instrumental rationality. There is another view of rationality which can be called value rationality, which means that you are committed to some goals and some values which are not about making another 5,000 rupees from selling carpets and another 10,000 rupees from renting out your shikara on the lake, right? But commitment to certain larger goals and then sacrificing and strategizing to achieve and pursue that goal, right? That conduct he calls not irrational, value rational. And value rational conduct is strategic conduct. It's not, and he separates it from impulsive conduct. He has four views, four arguments, four categories: value rational, instrumental rational, traditional, and impulsive. Traditional is simply, this is the way it's always been, I act this way. Impulsive is anger, frustration, etc., right? Impulsive. Right? But value rationality, which may have a lot of anger built into it, but anger is channelized, and a strategy is evolved, which might include sacrifices like going to jail, which might include sacrifices like financial setbacks, right? Which might include all that, but it's a strategic conduct, right? So what it shares with instrumental rationality is strategic conduct, but it has a very different notion of cost and benefit. Fairly high cost that conduct is prepared to pay for the pursuit of those worthy goals.